Previously, I did a video where I explained what a rightoid is and why they are an obstacle for the victory of the real right wing. There is, however, a closely related topic, which is basically the kind of politics that the rightoid generally engages with and consumes. This is slopulism. But what is slopulism? Last year, Endeavor wrote an article called Against Slopulism for Countercurrents. He defined slopulism as follows. Populism which has forsaken the concrete issues which initially gave it its appeal, demographics, inflation, job loss, cultural decline, etc., solely in favor of the emotional gratification derived from making one's political opponents angry. In other words, slopulism is a kind of messaging politics. The actual nuts and bolts of the political regime implemented by slopulist politicians doesn't deviate from the elite-centric neoliberal policies of the West, but it has changed its messaging. The elites are the problem, they're destroying our nations, and we need to win our countries back in order to prevent collapse. Consequently, these slopulists get in office, and then none of the substantial problems they campaigned on ever get solved, and in fact intensify. For example, the United States is still undergoing demographic change. A majority of those born in the US in recent years are non-white Hispanics. Projections state that the US will be majority non-white by about 2050 or so. Without remigration, the US is doomed to become a minority white country. Despite Trump's efforts at immigration control, he has not solved the fundamental demographic problem, and in fact has been somewhat complicit in making it worse through his expansions of H-1B visas and his practical amnesty regarding illegal immigrants already in the country. As he himself said, we quote-unquote need them to work on our farms, so he won't be going after them. The ICE episode in Minneapolis was basically just theater. There hasn't been a similar anti-immigration surge anywhere else, and even then they were selectively deporting people. It was hardly a mass deportation. Likewise, Trump in 2016 publicly flirted with the idea of single-payer healthcare. That of course didn't happen. All he did was repeal Obamacare's individual mandate. He also promised no new foreign wars. We have since gone to war against Venezuela and Iran, and we've been carrying out strikes against both ground and sea-based targets in various South American countries as part of the war on drugs. It might not be an exaggeration to say that Trump has drone-struck more people than Obama. Obama! International slopulism is a similar story. Meloni promised to reduce immigration to Italy, however, it expanded under her rule. Viktor Orban promised to do the same in Hungary, yet Hungary has seen increased immigration as well. Orban, famous populist and nationalist, joined the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. He was actually pretty notoriously corrupt. He even transferred control of 11 universities to his friends and allies. Of course, Hungarian politicians are known for their corruption, but Orban's reputation contributed to his loss against Peter Magyar in 2016, who ran on a campaign of reducing corruption in the government. This might remind us of the fact that Trump granted Elon Musk various legal exemptions and subsidies for Tesla and SpaceX, and then allowed him to run Doge for the short time that disaster was in existence. It seems as though there is a real connection between slopulists and corruption. This may be simply because slopulism is messaging politics, and the actual substance behind it consists of duplicitous politicians utilizing mass discontent and campism to gain popular support and power. This is instrumental populism at its finest. Tell the people that you will solve their problems and act in their interest, then act by increasing the power and financial resources of the elite. The hard reality is that populism, when the locus of this populist support is elite politicians, is just an exercise in demagogy. I've criticized much of elite theory, but what Moscow is right about is that elites have their own particular interests, and government positions must be manned by people with certain special skills and education sets, meaning that there's always going to be a trend toward elite-centric policies implemented by politicians. When politicians deign to ingratiate themselves among the masses, such as what frequently occurs during a populist campaign, they are only carrying out a theatrical performance. This performance is called ourism, basically the false message that a politician is a member of the common people, or one of us. The most blatant example of this was when Trump, a billionaire business tycoon who has never earned a wage in his life, did a photo op of himself serving food at a McDonald's drive-thru. But virtually every Democratic president engages in some form of ourism. Bush's outward demeanor, his southern accent, verbal slip-ups, and the appearance of low intelligence were all sort of deliberate. Bush was not dumb, he was an Ivy League law graduate, which means his IQ was probably at least around 120, if not higher. That's more or less the average for people with master's degrees. His hillbilly persona was basically just a means to convince his voters that he was one of us, sort of a provincial simpleton. Trump's verbal attacks against establishment politicians like Little Hands Marco Rubio or Lion Ted must be read in the same way. He was mirroring the thoughts and feelings of proletarian Republicans who were already predisposed to be against most of the entrenched party elite, who failed to deliver on immigration and the economy for decades. His immigration messaging, his championing of the forgotten man, his economic proposals, his foreign policy promises, these were all just practices of demagogy. And as Juan Donoso Cortez reminds us, demagogy is perhaps the worst and only outcome of democracy. Demagogy isn't a problem that is specific to any one politician, rather, it's a systemic issue. The form of democracy itself begets demagogy by making access to power contingent upon winning the explicit support of the people through elections. Those who naively have faith in democracy insist that democracy is a means for the people's voice to be heard and their interests met. But the reality is that politicians can simply signal toward the public's demands and then thereafter ignore or reject them. Democracy does not lose any legitimacy in the process, since the educational apparatus, as well as social pressure and ideological conformism, operate to keep the power discourse functioning in purely democratic parameters. Terms such as extremist or radical are employed to scare the public away from seeking alternatives to democracy, and they function in such a way as to constrain the power discourse in purely populist and democratic terms. The goal is bipartisan cooperation, respect for the office of the president, respect for checks and balances and democratic fairness, etc. What is legitimate is what falls under the rules of the Constitution. People are indoctrinated into this form of discourse, and it is extremely difficult to leave because this is what goes by the brand name politics. Anything outside of that is where the dragons and beasts live, like Antifa. As a consequence, those who desire a serious change to the system, or who are looking for an alternative, can only fall back on slopulism. Slopulism is the most quote-unquote revolutionary form of democracy that does not violate the dogma of the legitimate order because it operates on democratic discourse. To combat slopulism, that order must lose legitimacy. There must be a change in power discourse. Another reason why sloppuless politicians don't actually carry out their promises is because democratic politicians are just technicians for the system. To understand this, I think it's helpful to relate an experience a lot of people have had. Many who get involved in local politics start out rather idealistic. They want to make a change. They want to support their community. They want to lift people from oppression or reduce corruption. These are laudable goals, but very quickly after securing a political position, whether it be as a functionary, apparatchik, or an actual politician, they realize that they are simply inheriting a machine that relies on any number of human cogs of which the aspirant becomes a part. The nature of liberal democracy is basically procedural, as John Rawls wrote in A Theory of Justice. There isn't much room for personality, sovereign action, or revolutionism from within the system. What one does as a political actor in democracy is simply to carry out the large number of rote procedures that mediate the exercise of power, such as approving of bills or ordinances, writing memos, taking minutes from political meetings, networking, meeting with representatives, and so forth. Most of these jobs are just kinds of bureaucracy. It would be rather difficult to make a serious change without altering that bureaucracy, something that a single person cannot achieve by himself. This is, by the way, why entryism doesn't work. At the higher levels of government, the same problem applies. Presidents inherit the geopolitical situation of their predecessors, the bureaucratic machinery, the laws and regulations, and the structure of power, as well as its processes. Most of the actual exercise of power is carried out by other people in different positions. Foreign policy is mostly decided by think tanks in the Pentagon. Economic policy is the job of Congress. Social policy and budgeting, also Congress. Since these people as a whole are not replaced each time there's a presidential election, the president is simply an umpire between these forces and has no actual power to change the system from within. Even in the event he were to attempt to become the sovereign of the exception by declaring a state of emergency, he would have to deal with the bureaucratic structure of the military and the possibility that it would not comply with his orders. The problem of actually selecting generals who might be loyal would run up against the problem that all the available generals have had connections with previous presidents as well as other politicians, and they're just as much of the part of the machinery as everyone else. They too are technicians. The main point I'm trying to make is that governments that distribute sovereignty do not afford to any particular person or position the ability to carry out revolutionary changes unless somehow a populist party were to secure a majority in all sectors of government as well as the military. This isn't a situation like Tsarist Russia, where the monarch and the members of his cabinet held so much power that they could practically alter the form of government overnight from a monarchy to a liberal state after the February Revolution. If sovereignty is distributed, then the machinery can only carry out its ultimate logic. Eventually, it will become a totalitarian singularity, as Bertrand de Juvenel argues, but until that point, it is next to impossible to actually change it politically, at least in a unilateral manner. Things are bad enough for the prospects of populism, but there is a problem specifically with populism itself, which is why we are dealing with this Slopulist phenomenon. Right-wing populism can only live under democratic conditions, and because of that, it tends to drag political discourse to the lowest possible level. What is a problem for democracy? Its tendency toward demagogy, economism, and totalitarianism is also a problem for statist forms of populism. What the mass public wants is not always wise, and if political decisions were left to them, we would have a culturally totalitarian, econocentric state which relies mostly upon force and discipline to ensure compliance, rather than ideological unity or federative autonomy. The people has no conscience, as one writer remarked, and will not relent in its use of power. The warnings of Colonel Lenin in this regard are important. You can have popular equality or liberty, not both. Democracy always precedes tyranny, and populist demagogy is the final stage before the scale tips. Of course, elites don't always have the best political programs in mind either, but this isn't necessarily a problem with the existence of an elite. Rather, it is a problem with an elite which has the wrong philosophy and political structure. The ultimate answer to slopulism is aristocracy. We must once again be ruled by philosophers and not lawyers or economists. So long as economic matters remain foremost in political discourse, and so long as sovereignty does not take its rightful place at the center of political discourse, we will always have masses of people clamoring for this or that organization. If the service of the market is the only reason for the existence of the state, then there will be no reason to tolerate it. Indeed, I think left populism is probably the only consistent part of populism, and it will be inevitable if we do not correct the problem, which is the economism of the state and the formal liberty of the market and the bourgeoisie. There is a serious inconsistency in right populism, which is that it valorizes the free market while at once denigrating its consequences. Billionaires have unbridled power to lobby for mass immigration, to dominate culture, and to enclose various parts of the economy, such that they cannot be under the control of the middle or lower classes. Marxism is just the logical response to the development of capitalism. Now that liberal capitalism is a total social fact, as Michel likes to say, every form of political resistance that occurs within the democratic system, all forms of populism, whether they be social democracy or national populism, are simply going to ratify it. Despite all the negative effects that capitalism has on the working class, right populists continue to support it as a counter-signal against communism. Populism is either left-wing or it is incoherent. But ultimately, because populism is so easily captured by democratic forms of discourse and politics, it really can't be anything other than a slight modification of the mode of liberal hegemony. Slopulism is not a function of a degeneration of right-wing politics, but rather is the final logic of liberal democracy.